All right, our last explanation for why economic growth happens, all right, at the country level. Institutions. Well, I just want to highlight this one from the geography that I didn't bring up because I was just, you know, didn't think I needed the slides for it, but I did have this graph here that kind of, for the geographic explanation, we have latitude here on the x-axis, growth here, or sorry, GDP per capita on the y-axis. And so what we can see is generally countries further from the equator are richer. So this is some evidence for geography mattering to some extent, although you can see this is not the tightest relationship. All right, institutions. Humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interaction consist of both informal constraints and formal rules. We are going to focus on the formal ones. So formal institutions are typically what we think of as institutions. Informal institutions actually is another word for culture. All right. Some debate on that, but there's some maybe things that are kind of informal institutions that are not culture, but generally we think of informal institutions as being cultural, formal institutions as being kind of uh, the institutions of a society, the things that, kind of are that people come up with to organize the country. All right. And they essentially provide the incentive structure. You could think of even within a, within a given industry or company, what is the incentives? What are the incentives that have been created? Is there incentives to work as a team? Is there incentives to work as an individual? Even think this class has its own incentive structure. There are grades. This class would be very different if there were no grades. So, example, group projects versus not group projects. If I were grading on a curve, if I were saying, hey, only 10 of you are going to get A's, the rest, sorry. That creates a very different incentive structure than if I said, hey, you know what your grade is going to be? Your grade is going to be whatever the lowest person in the class. That's what I'm going to give to everybody. So you essentially, the type of institutions that you impose create different incentives. And you can think about that at the country level. So they're humanly devised. We come up with them. They kind of set constraints. Hey, you can do this, you can't do this. And that shapes the incentives. What is going to be rewarded? Okay. You could think about this. These are formal institutions. You can also think about this in informal institutions, culture. Culturally, what do we value? Who do we look up to and say, hey, that person has it going on. That person is doing it right. That's going to shape the incentives for the next generation to say, what is valorized? All right. Now, again, we're on the formal side. We're not talking about culture. We're talking about formal institutions. Okay. So how do we do property rights? How do we decide who owns what and how well are those protected? So can I be sure if I work hard, I build this company up, or I work hard on my farm and I make it really productive, how can I be sure somebody isn't going to come along and just take it from me? Somebody with a gun isn't going to come along and just take it from me and say, nope, it's mine now. All right. In the US, we take these for granted, but in many parts of the world, they do not have strong property rights. I can tell you because my in-laws own a bunch of rubber trees in Cambodia that bandits are they're constantly fighting with bandits to maintain the property line. For years, all my father-in-law would talk about is his rubber trees and these bandits, and eventually he sold them. Finally sold the rubber trees. And yeah, now he has nothing to talk about. All right. Democracy. So, again, how do you organize your political system? How do you decide who's in charge? Who are they accountable to? This is an institution, the legal system. How is it innocent till proven guilty, guilty till proven innocent? Do we have a flexible legal system? So you think of the English common law system is very flexible. Essentially you can set new precedents, you can overturn old ones. The French civil code is very rigid. All right, we have kind of a rule for everything. We got to check what the rule says. How easy is it to start a business? Can anybody start a business? Does it take me a year to get the right permits to start a business? Actually, think about this in housing. Does it take me a year to start housing? Does it take me 3 days to start a housing project? That's going to have very different housing regimes. That's really going to matter for prices in that market. So how easy does it start a business? Can incumbents keep competitors out? If I'm a business, I don't want any competitors. Can I kind of subvert government and use that to keep my competitors out? What are the constraints on political power? What are the checks and balances? Okay, so these are all examples of formal institutions that are going to differ country by country. Okay, And this is very complicated because what's written down may not be how it actually works. We see this often in the US. This is a criticism levied against the US. What's written down in the Constitution, what's written down in the Declaration, the institutions that are stated there, often the US does not live up to or does not extend to its full citizenry. All right. And so these are, you can think about these as, okay, what does the country say its institutions are and how do those actually play out on the ground? Okay. All right, and so if again we're taking this metaphor to the individual level, what institutions has the individual been exposed to? What kind of educational institutions have they been exposed to? What is the legal system there? How easy was it for them to start a business? How easy was it for them to hire workers? That sort of thing will determine each person's income, economic success. All right. So again, we're thinking about the country level, but you can also kind of, if it helps wrap your head around it, you could think about it at the individual level as well. Okay, institutions. What are some evidence? Let's look at some evidence. So here we have average protection against risk of expropriation. What does that mean? This is property rights. This just means, how protected are you against somebody taking your stuff? Higher is better, means that your property rights are secure. Over here we have GDP, and you can see there is a very strong relationship. Okay, countries with good property rights, all up here, are much richer than countries with poor property rights down here. All right, here's another great example. Okay, this is North Korea here, South Korea here. North and South Korea, similar culture, similar geography. Okay, they are divided after the Korean War, so they are essentially become two separate countries with very different institutions. So you have in the South, you have a market economy. You typically there's a little bit of dictatorship in the South, but it is a market economy. So there's, start a business, there's markets, there's not as much, there's some like state, there's some like state sponsorship of industry, but it's generally a market economy. North, you have communism, you have basically a dictatorship. Fast forward to the present. All right, this is the satellite. There's a satellite imagery of the night lights. If we were to do this in 1950, they would look the same. They would all be dark. Okay. Night lights are a proxy for growth. The more lit up a country is, the higher the GDP. This is luminosity. In fact, development economists often will use luminosity, how lit up an area is, as a proxy for growth when growth data is not available, when GDP data is not available. So this is a great example of institutions mattering. We have same culture, same geography. I mean, they're on a peninsula, similar geography, similar resources. We have a dictatorship with socialism in the north, and we have a market economy in the south. Fast forward 50, 60 years, the south is one of the richest countries in the world. The north is one of the poorest. All right. So if we're thinking about institutions, what do we need at the country level to get innovation? What do we need? Well, there's lots of debate about this. And before the rise of China, democracy would be on this list. Okay. But, there's lots of, so this sort of thinking about what a country needs to grow is changing over time. And again, there's lots of debate about this. But in general, it's thought of, okay, you need some education, you need some human capital generation, you need some, schooling, some way to get your population knowledge. So education, you're gonna need some educational institutions, you're gonna need property rights. Without property rights, there's no incentive to innovate or to improve. Rule of law. You're going to need to know that the law is respected. You're going to need to know that contracts are going to be enforced. You're going to need to know that, the crime rate is, low enough, and you need markets and market access. So you're going to need a market economy, at least in some sectors, and you're going to need access to that market. You're going to need it. If I start a business, the people I'm competing with can't keep me out. Okay. Again, whatever, you can't be this is obviously, no country is perfect. No country has property rights for all of its citizens. No country has rule of law for all of its citizens, or perfect rule of law. No country has perfect market access. Like, this is increasingly becoming a problem in the US, this right here, where incumbents are keeping, large incumbents are able to keep competitors out. You think of our big dysfunctioning sectors, essentially there's no market access. You can't start a hospital. In most cities, you can't start a hospital. All right, the other hospitals get to vote whether you can start a hospital or not. Guess what? They vote no. All right, so this is as if Starbucks got to vote if there was a new coffee shop or not in their neighborhood. Guess what? They're always voting no. So we have limited market access in healthcare in the U.S. There's limited market access in housing. It's virtually impossible to build new housing in our superstar cities. We have limited market access in education. At least that's changing a little bit, but it's very hard to start a world-class university in the U.S. So, a lot of our sectors that are kind of dysfunctional, there's a lack of market access. All right, that's not even to get into where we have lots of monopolies in certain other sectors that are able to keep competitors out. So no country is going to be perfect, but in general, you're going to need some semblance of these if you want to have innovation. Otherwise, there's no incentive to innovate. You either don't have the raw skills, talent, if you don't have this, or if you don't have these things, why would I innovate? It will just get taken away from me. And if you don't have this, I literally can't enter the market. Okay. All right. Now, last thing, we have to think about redistribution. We have to think about the people displaced by innovation. Innovation, by its definition, will create. I'll just jump out of here actually for this. So, innovation, by its definition, is going to displace people. When you are innovating something, when you come up with some new way to do things or come up with a new invention, you're displacing something that came before, right? If I come up with a better microphone, easier microphone, Rode goes out of business, all right, or their business goes down, right, and workers get displaced, workers get laid off. In my little simple example where we're all on an island farming, when that one person comes up with the best way to farm, it can now feed 10 people. Well, 9 people got displaced. 9 people were no longer farmers, okay? And again, you could think about this in the positive way. All right, there's 9 people that can go off and fulfill their dreams, become singers or whatever. But the real world is much messier than that. If I'm working on making microphones for my entire life and I'm 60 years old, and all of a sudden I lose my job at the microphone factory, it's going to be very hard for me to find some new work and some new growing industry. So if you have an economy that is able to produce innovation, if you have an economy that's able to get this sustained growth, get this innovation, get these new inventions, get these better ways of doing things, you are going to have people displaced by that innovation. And you're going to need to figure out, what are you going to do with those people? All right. You're going to need, how can we get those people into the growing industries? How can you get those people new jobs? How can you deal with the income loss that comes from that displacement without having a revolution on your hands? All right. So you're going to need some redistribution. You're going to need something to take from the people who've innovated, the people who've come up with new and better ways, and give it to the people that has displaced. They're not going to do it. Usually they're not going to do it just willingly. Oh, hey, I just put you out of business. Well, here, you can have some of my profits. Usually that's not the way it works. So you're going to need some sort of redistribution system, some sort of social safety net if you have a country with innovation. Okay, that's a primer on growth. You have the world before growth, okay? The old ways, whatever, cruel, brutish, and short. That's what life is like. You have the new growing pie, new innovations, new stuff. Quality of life is going up. Standard of living is going up. You get all this innovation. How do you get that? There's a bunch of different theories. Does it come from culture? Does it come from geography, your endowments? Does it come from the set of institutions you have? All right, we went through all that. Once you get that growth, careful, you got to worry about the people displaced. It's called creative destruction. All right. You got to have institutions. If you want to have growth, you have the institutions that create growth, but you also have the institutions to deal with the people displaced by growth. What are we doing in this we have this whole we haven't even talked about anything in the past yet. We're just talking about growth. Just because because there's so many misconceptions about this, I just want everyone to start at the same page. In this class, we're looking mostly at the 19th century US. We're going to think about the policies that created that kind of average 2% growth that we saw. We're going to think about policies that maybe hindered that growth or held certain groups back from enjoying the fruits of that growth. And we're going to think about the US institutions that led to that growth. Where did they come from? How did they evolve? over the 19th century. This is economic history class. There's going to be a lot of graphs. There's going to be a lot of tables. There's going to be a lot of data. I love that stuff. Hopefully you love that stuff too. But that's just a warning. All right. That's it. That's it for the first week.